June 4, 1943. The pencil trembled slightly as Unfitziaverer Burckhardt wrote in his hidden diary, aware that the words he set down would have earned him solitary confinement had they been discovered. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, stared in disbelief. Electric light poured from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation stretching across the Texas plains long after nightfall. In Germany, blackout regulations had turned cities into shadows since 1940. Even before the war, most rural villages had never known electricity at all. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsing society, power flowed without restraint. The train carried 1,850 veterans of the Afrika Korps. They had not arrived in cattle cars or freight wagons, but in cushioned Pullman coaches with dining service and sleeping berths. The entire town of Mahia had gathered to watch their arrival. None of the prisoners yet understood that this moment marked the beginning of a slow and irreversible collapse of everything they believed about the world. Only weeks earlier, in North Africa, the war had ended for them. On May 13, 1943, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered what remained of the Axis forces in Tunisia, nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. These were not broken conscripts, but veterans of the Desert War, men who had once driven the British back across Libya. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a decorated officer whose diary would later become one of the most revealing records of captivity. Their first shock came not in America, but in the ports of Algeria. At Oran, the prisoners were processed with an efficiency that unsettled them. Thousands were registered, photographed, examined, and vaccinated with a speed that surpassed anything they had experienced in their own army. American officers addressed them in fluent German, explained their rights under the Geneva Convention, and moved them through the system with practiced precision. Then came the food. Oberleutnant Hans Müller later wrote that during those days in the transit camps, they ate better than they had in months at the front. White bread, real coffee, meat served daily. At first, they assumed it was deception, a temporary performance meant to impress or humiliate them. Only later did they realize it was standard issue. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic shattered what remained of their assumptions. Liberty ships, built in days rather than months, hauled tens of thousands of prisoners at a time. Some had been constructed in less than a week, a fact so unbelievable that many prisoners dismissed it as American boasting. During the crossing, the psychological shock deepened. Sailors discarded half-eaten meals without comment. Milk was poured out when it warmed. Bread was thrown away because it had gone stale. To men who had survived on rationed crusts and ersatz coffee, the waste felt obscene. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded that the crew disposed of more food in a single day than his entire company had received in a week during the final months in Africa. They did not do it to mock the prisoners, they simply did not think about it at all. As the ships neared the American coast, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern noticed something that unsettled him more than the food or the waste. Mounted above the bridge was a rotating radar antenna. Radar, he knew, was rare even in the German Navy, reserved for only the most critical vessels. Here it appeared on an ordinary cargo ship. In that moment, he later wrote, he understood that Germany was not merely losing a war, it had been outmatched from the beginning. When the coastline finally appeared, the illusion collapsed completely. The port of Norfolk sprawled for miles, alive with motion. Cranes loaded and unloaded ships without pause. Rail lines branched in every direction. Factories and warehouses stretched farther than the eye could see. In a single day, the port handled more cargo than Hamburg did in a week. For the first time, the prisoners began to grasp the scale of what they were facing. Not an enemy weakened by decadence, but an industrial power operating at a level they had never imagined possible. The train journey inland only deepened that realization. As the cars rolled westward from Norfolk, the prisoners pressed against the windows in silence. Mile after mile passed under a sky still bright with electric glow. Towns that, by German standards, would have been considered insignificant shone with illuminated storefronts, street lamps, and homes lit room by room. Factories operated through the night, their windows blazing, parking lots full even at midnight. Nothing slept. In Martinsville, in Danville, in Greensboro, they saw more light than existed in entire German cities. One prisoner later wrote that the darkness they had known in Europe simply did not exist here. It was as if night itself had been defeated. The trains slowed at rail yards where mechanized systems refueled and resupplied entire locomotives in minutes. Electric cranes swung with effortless precision. Water pumps roared. Coal conveyors poured black rivers into tenders without a single shovel lifted by hand. German soldiers who had spent years loading railcars with sweat and muscle stared in disbelief. What disturbed them most was not the machinery, but the people. Railway workers wore clean clothes and sturdy boots. They drank bottled soda and smoked freely during breaks. Many owned automobiles, parked casually beside the tracks. In Germany, even skilled workers could not dream of such possessions. As the train pushed deeper into the interior, the scale of American industry became impossible to dismiss. Outside Louisville, enormous chemical and rubber plants rose from the landscape, newly built and humming with activity. Prisoners learned that these facilities, constructed in little more than a year, produced more synthetic rubber than Germany had managed at its wartime peak. Entire complexes powered by electricity generated from rivers that had been harnessed in a matter of months. One former chemical engineer among the prisoners recognized the equipment immediately. He knew the processes, the complexity, the resources required. And he understood something else just as clearly: Germany could never match this output. Not in 5 years. Not in 10. When the train passed Detroit, silence fell inside the cars. In the distance, the Ford Willow Run plant stretched across the horizon, a city unto itself. Bombers rolled off assembly lines in steady rhythm, one after another, hour after hour. The factory consumed more power than many European capitals. The prisoners watched in stunned quiet as aircraft fuselages moved like products on a conveyor belt, each one nearly complete before the next emerged behind it. A former Luftwaffe pilot pressed his forehead against the glass and whispered that everything he had been told was a lie. These were not crude machines built by amateurs. This was precision on a scale he had never imagined. As the train rolled onward through Missouri and Kansas, the landscape changed but the message did not. Vast grain elevators towered over rail lines, each filled with harvests large enough to feed entire nations. In the stockyards, cattle waited by the tens of thousands. The air smelled of feed and meat and industry. Prisoners watched workers eat thick sandwiches during breaks, meat layered between white, eaten casually, without ceremony. By the time they reached Texas, the illusion of German superiority had collapsed completely. At Camp Hearn, the prisoners were housed in wooden barracks fitted with electric lights, steam heat, and running water. There were hot showers. There were latrines that flushed. There was a hospital stocked with medicines they had only heard rumors of: sulfa drugs, morphine, even penicillin, administered freely. Doctors among the prisoners were stunned. In Germany, such supplies were reserved for the elite or the gravely wounded. Here they were used without hesitation, even on enemy soldiers. The kitchens were another revelation. Food was prepared in industrial quantities: fresh bread, meat, vegetables, milk. There was more than enough. So much, in fact, that excess was discarded. Men who had survived on thin soup and ration bread stood frozen as edible food was thrown away simply because regulations required surplus. One former hotel chef wrote that he cried as he watched perfectly good loaves tossed into bins. Not from hunger, but from the realization of what this abundance meant. When prisoners were later assigned to labor details on nearby farms and in factories, the final illusions shattered. They saw tractors larger than houses, combines that replaced hundreds of men, and farms run by families who lived better than most German professionals. Electricity reached every field, every barn, every farmhouse. Workers ate meat daily. Even laborers owned radios, refrigerators, and automobiles. One prisoner, assigned to a cotton gin in Texas, wrote that a single machine processed more cotton in an hour than his entire village could manage in a month. Another, working in a sugar beet field in Nebraska, learned that a single American farm produced more food than several German districts combined. By the end of 1943, the transformation was complete. The men who had arrived convinced of their nation's destiny now understood that they had been fighting a war already lost before it began. Not because of courage or morale, but because of math, steel, electricity, fuel, and production on a scale they had never imagined possible. The collapse of belief was quiet. There were no speeches, no dramatic confessions. Just silence, and the slow realization that everything they had been taught about the world beyond Germany's borders had been a lie. The change that followed was not sudden, but it was absolute. By the winter of 1943, the camps no longer held men waiting to return to battle. They held men quietly re-examining everything they believed about their country, their leaders, and themselves. The most fanatical among them had once dominated camp life. They shouted slogans, enforced salutes, and tried to maintain the rituals of loyalty. But the environment around them made those performances feel hollow. When a man had spent his day watching American farmers harvest more grain in hours than Germany could in weeks, the old slogans rang false. When he had eaten better in captivity than his family had at home, fanaticism lost its power. American intelligence officers observed the change carefully. Reports described a steady erosion of ideological certainty. Prisoners no longer argued when confronted with production figures or photographs. They asked questions instead. How many factories were there? How long had this been going on? How much electricity did the country really produce? Camp libraries began filling with translated American newspapers and history books. At first, few touched them. Then curiosity took hold. Prisoners began reading about industrialization, labor movements, and the structure of the American economy. They read about elections, about unions, about the absence of rationing. The realization that this system functioned without terror or forced conformity unsettled them more than any confrontation ever had. The camp newspapers, written and edited by selected prisoners under supervision, changed tone over time. Early issues clung to nationalist language and careful neutrality. By late 1943, articles discussed post-war reconstruction, democratic institutions, and the failures of authoritarian economics. The editors no longer had to censor enthusiasm, the readers were already thinking ahead. One former officer wrote privately that the greatest shock was not defeat, but understanding why defeat had been inevitable. Germany, he concluded, had tried to fight a modern industrial war with a 19th-century economy and a 20th-century mythology. America had fought with factories, logistics, and an abundance so vast it reshaped human behavior. For many, the final break came during work assignments outside the camps. Prisoners labored beside American civilians who treated them without fear or hatred. Conversations happened easily. Jokes were exchanged. No one spat at them. No one demanded obedience. The idea that these people were decadent or weak became impossible to sustain. One prisoner wrote that he had spoken with a factory foreman who owned a modest house, 2 cars, and a radio. The man complained not about hunger or shortages, but about taxes and long hours. This, the prisoner noted, was supposed to be the oppressed working class. As months passed, the psychological distance between what they had been taught and what they now saw became unbearable. The myths that had sustained them, racial destiny, economic superiority, moral inevitability, collapsed under the weight of lived experience. By the time the war ended, many prisoners understood something their leaders never admitted: Germany had not lost because of betrayal or bad luck. It had lost because it faced an opponent with deeper resources, broader education, and a society capable of sustaining total war without breaking itself. When repatriation finally came, some prisoners feared returning home more than captivity. They knew what awaited them: ruins, hunger, and a population still struggling to understand defeat. They also knew that they would carry a truth few others possessed: that the world beyond Germany had not been weak or decadent, but powerful beyond imagining. And for many of them, that knowledge would be impossible to unlearn. The return to Germany did not bring closure. For many of the former prisoners, it only deepened the fracture between what they had once believed and what now surrounded them. The train rides home passed through landscapes of ruin, cities reduced to skeletal frames, rail lines twisted and broken, factories silent or destroyed. The contrast with what they had seen across the Atlantic was unbearable. Where America had expanded, Germany had collapsed inward. Men who had lived in clean, electrified camps now walked through streets without power or running water. Families scavenged bricks from bombed buildings to rebuild walls. Children played among ruins, thin and quiet. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer still. The black market replaced the economy, and hunger replaced ideology as the central concern of daily life. For many returnees, the shock was not merely material but moral. They had left a nation convinced of its destiny and returned to one stripped of illusion. The myths that had once given meaning to sacrifice no longer held. The war had not been lost because of betrayal or lack of will, but because the foundation itself had been hollow. Some tried to speak of what they had seen. They spoke of factories larger than cities, of farms that fed millions, of workers who lived better than German officers. Most listeners refused to believe them. Others listened in silence, unable to reconcile the stories with years of propaganda. A few, especially the young, listened closely. The former prisoners carried an invisible burden. They had seen the future and knew it did not belong to the world they had left behind. Many struggled to adapt, caught between shame and understanding, between loyalty and truth. Some withdrew into silence. Others became teachers, engineers, clerks, men determined that the next generation would not inherit the same illusions. In the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt, fragments of what they had witnessed began to reappear in altered form. Modern factories, new infrastructure, the slow return of stability. Yet for those who had crossed the ocean as captives, the memory remained vivid. They had seen, firsthand, what abundance looked like when married to organization and scale. They had seen a society capable of sustaining power without terror. And so, quietly and without ceremony, the most enduring consequence of their captivity took shape, not in official histories or military records, but in changed minds. The war had ended for them long before the surrender was signed. It ended the moment they realized the world was far larger, and far more complex, than the one they had been taught to believe in. Years later, when memories had softened and the urgency of survival had faded, many of those men found that the experience still followed them. It surfaced in small, unexpected moments: a factory whistle at dawn, the hum of a generator, the smell of machine oil, the glow of electric light spilling from a shop window at night. These things carried meanings that others could not understand. They were reminders of a moment when the world had cracked open and revealed its true scale. Some spoke of it only in fragments, careful not to provoke suspicion or resentment. Others remained silent, knowing that what they had seen could not be explained to those who had not seen it themselves. How could one describe the sensation of realizing, in a single instant, that an entire worldview had been constructed on deliberate illusion? That the enemy was not monstrous or decadent, but simply organized, educated, and overwhelmingly productive. For many, the realization carried a quiet sense of guilt. They had fought, suffered, and killed in the service of a system that had promised greatness but delivered ruin. And yet, during captivity, they had been fed, housed, and treated with a consistency and dignity that stood in painful contrast to what they had known at home. This contradiction did not produce admiration so much as a deep, disorienting confusion. It forced questions no ideology could easily answer. Some tried to forget. They buried themselves in rebuilding, in family, in the routines of survival. Others became voices of caution, warning against blind obedience and the seduction of certainty. A few went on to teach, to write, or to quietly influence the rebuilding of institutions, carrying with them an unspoken lesson learned not from books or speeches, but from lived experience. What endured most was not admiration for another nation, but the shattering of inevitability. They had learned that power was not mystical, nor rooted in destiny or blood, but in systems, education, industry, logistics, and the willingness to invest in people rather than myths. It was a realization that could never be fully unlearned. For these men, the war did not end with surrender or treaties. It ended slowly, in the years that followed, as they rebuilt their lives in the shadow of what they had seen. And though few ever spoke of it openly, many carried the same quiet understanding to their graves: that the greatest defeat they suffered was not on the battlefield, but in the moment. They realized how profoundly they had been deceived, and how much the world beyond their borders had already moved on without them. In the decades that followed, that realization settled into the fabric of post-war life in ways both visible and unseen. As cities rose from rubble and factories hummed again, the men who had once been prisoners carried with them an unspoken comparison. Every new machine installed, every power line strung across a field, every factory rebuilt was measured, consciously or not, against what they had witnessed across the ocean. Some became advocates for modernization, quietly pushing for efficiency, education, and technical reform. They spoke less of ideology and more of infrastructure. They argued for vocational training, for investment in engineering, for systems that worked regardless of politics. Others remained silent, sensing that the truth they carried would sound like betrayal in a country still nursing its wounds. Among themselves, however, they spoke plainly. They remembered the ease with which American society had mobilized without terror, the way abundance had flowed not from conquest but from coordination. They remembered that power did not need to shout to be overwhelming. It only needed to function. Many watched the new Germany take shape with cautious hope. They saw lessons absorbed imperfectly but steadily: the rebuilding of industry, the spread of education, the return of civic trust. They recognized echoes of what they had once seen from train windows in Texas and Ohio, not copies, but reflections. And they understood that this time, the transformation had to come from within. As years passed, the men grew old. Their stories were rarely written down. When they were often dismissed as personal reflections rather than historical testimony. Yet beneath those recollections lay a shared understanding that the war had not merely been lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in factories never built, schools never funded, and truths never told. What remained was a quiet legacy. Not of bitterness, but of awareness. A recognition that strength without honesty collapses, that ideology without reality devours itself, and that nations rise not through myth, but through the patient, unglamorous work of building things that last. And so, long after uniforms were folded away and medals forgotten, the final lesson endured, not as a slogan or a victory, but as a warning written into memory, that the greatest power a nation can possess is not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to understand the world as it truly is, and the humility to learn from it. In the end, what lingered most strongly was not bitterness, but a kind of sober clarity. Time had stripped away anger and pride alike, leaving only the quiet recognition of how easily a people could be led astray when truth was replaced by certainty. The men who had once marched beneath banners now understood how fragile belief could be when it rested on fear rather than fact. They watched the new generations grow up without the weight of uniforms or slogans, and many felt a strange mixture of relief and responsibility. Relief that their sons would not be asked to die for illusions. Responsibility because they alone remembered how convincing those illusions had once been. Some tried to speak of it, cautiously, without accusation, but often found that memory itself was unwelcome. The world was eager to move forward, not backward. Yet even as decades passed, small moments continued to stir the past. A factory whistle at dawn. A freight train rumbling through the night. A brightly lit supermarket aisle filled with goods once unimaginable. These ordinary sights carried echoes of that first revelation, the moment when the scale of another society had overturned everything they believed about strength and destiny. A few of them, now old men, would sometimes sit quietly and think back to the long train rides across America. They remembered the silence in the railcars as realization settled in, the shared understanding that nothing would ever look the same again. No speeches had been made. No arguments won. The truth had simply revealed itself, piece by piece, in steel, electricity, and abundance. What remained was not admiration, nor resentment, but perspective. They had learned that power did not need to shout, that confidence did not require cruelty, and that myths collapse quickly when confronted by reality. It was a lesson learned too late to change the past, but not too late to shape how the future would be remembered. And so, quietly, without monuments or declarations, the final transformation took place. Not in governments or armies, but within individuals who carried the knowledge forward in silence, understanding at last that the most enduring victories are not won through conquest, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth.